I feel like America right now doesn't really have much to hold on to. It doesn't know its past very well, and it certainly doesn't talk about anything um, let's say, Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. It seems to be like a void. But what's happened to all that? And is America struggling right now to find its identity? What do you think?
I think America is going through an interesting transitional phase. And I'll just put something into context for the very recent history, because I think it's worth saying that President Trump was re-elected in November of 2024. All seven battlefield states voted for him. He got the majority of the votes cast. So no one can argue that the Americans didn't know what they were voting for. Okay, and that's quite an important point, because you're talking about an American identity, and Trump is at present representing the wishes of his constituency, which is the majority of Americans who voted. Now, that majority is not Anglo-Saxon or Hispanic or Amerindian or Indian or any of the others. They're American. And I think it's very, very important. It's a point I think I've made to you before. We talk about African Americans, okay, or Black Americans. We don't talk about European Americans in the same way. So there is a distinguishing feature there about American culture, that it's not unified. And remember, it's only recently that President Trump has made English the official language of the United States.
I'm surprised he's done that, actually. I'm surprised he's done that, because you would have thought that he would have scrapped that as well and wanted no association with any European country whatsoever, the way he's going.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting point, but he can't forget his own European heritage. His mother was Scottish, but being American, you made the point about, well, is it Abraham Lincoln? Is it George Washington? Most American history starts in the minds of the current generation in 1776. We have the 13 colonies settled by Britain beforehand. So you clearly, when it comes to Thanksgiving, that's going all the way down the annals of history to Plymouth Rock and the founding fathers. Never talked about the founding mothers, which is also an important point. And there are various excellent maps you can get of the different American nations that predated European settlement. So that is largely skipped over. And the parallel, which I'm familiar with, is with Australia, because although it was a sort of hunter-gathering environment, the Australians had areas they would work in and, collect. There are defined areas that you could associate with one group or another in the pre-European settlement with Australia. In America, there's even more information about that. It's very rarely discussed.
Basically, I was getting into this, and then suddenly Netflix dropped a show called American Primeval. And there's a great sense of alcoholism and just kind of butchery and just general. People had to be pretty hardcore to survive those kind of things. And that is recent. That, I mean, Europe at this time is probably quite civilized in comparison to this crazy history that Americans had to go through. And now you go to America, and they have a different kind of relationship with alcohol. I'm talking about alcohol because that kind of sprung up at me as maybe nowadays they have this problem with alcohol. They're either like, if you have a couple of beers in America, they think you've got a problem with alcoholism, or they're extreme and they're drinking far too much. They don't have this kind of middle ground we do in Europe. And I wonder if there's something underlying from this past that they're not addressing, which could also be factoring into this craziness which is going on now, where they don't know who they are in relationship to Canada, to Europe, or anybody. It's almost like they have no grounding or anything to hold on to.
It's an interesting way you've put it. That they don't have a grounding, or they're looking to make Canada the 51st state, or to buy Greenland, or to develop Gaza as beach property. And I
To be
think
fair,
that has,
that's the idea of one man, really.
yeah,
So it's quite hard to sort of say the whole generation, even the people who voted for him, because these were all things he never mentioned before
um,
he got voted
I
in.
think a lot of Trump supporters are just working on the basis that he says these things, they're going to go nowhere. All right, so
Mm,
that one I can understand. Right,
mm,
go back a century, and America had prohibition. So its relationship with alcohol has been very odd over a number of years. And I've heard this put, that the after work drinks might be one half or one bottle of a beer, and then everyone goes home. Whereas our idea of afternoon drinks, yeah, let's just say that we
closing
usually
time.
we get kicked out.
We
Okay,
get kicked. So that's what the bell's for. Yeah.
that's right. But I'd put it in another way. I mean, you were talking about identity and development. Johnny Cash's song about Ira Hayes. Ira Hayes was one of the flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, something that we both looked into in the past. Okay, and he was the only member of the U.S. Marines who raised the flags near Jima, who had Amerindian heritage. And his story is tragic because he couldn't cope with the adulation and basically drunk himself to death. Okay, so there is a little bit there that it goes back to the annexation of America from sea to shining sea. Remember, we have the 13 colonies, the Louisiana Purchase, and then what you're talking about with American Primeval is that westward push, and it is the best way to annoy any American is to talk about imperialism. But you consider the renaming in some quarters of the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. Well, there was a period of time when Mexico extended all the way to Florida in terms of Spanish settlement and Spanish control.
Mm-hmm.
We even had a Russian colony down the west coast of America for a short period of time. Okay, so you have quite a strong European imperial presence, most of whom could do business and trade with the indigenous population. And that's part of American history that if you look at the westward push, it was the extension of the 13 colonies, okay, saying we own this land and ignoring the rights of those people who are indigenous there. And again, I make the parallel with Australia. But there's a worldwide coalition now of indigenous peoples who have survived this particular process. And you can go right around the world, in Canada, in Lapland, a whole of the world, that the experience has been very similar. that where the Europeans could settle, they also displaced the existing population. It's not true in Africa, and it's not true in East Asia. And the reason being that the European physiology couldn't cope with the diseases that they encountered. So, with the exception of South Africa, there is no real permanent European settlement anywhere in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay.
Well, so what's the difference between, say, a colony like India, which was then reclaimed by Gandhi, and then Australia and America, where they were not reclaimed?
All right. Okay. I would put that down to the fact that India, China, Africa were inhospitable environments whereby the disease regime was sufficiently different from Europe, and European settlers never had the immunity to survive. You compare, and I think this is a point that you want to run over. You talk about American identity. We're talking about North American identity. We're talking very specifically about the United States. You look what happens with the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of Central and Latin America. And Neil Young's album Zuma was banned in Spain for the song Cortés the Killer. In that instance, the Spanish heritage, the indigenous heritage, and the slave heritage have largely combined. Okay, but disease played a huge part in Spanish and to a lesser degree Portuguese conquest of Central and Latin America. So there is a biological explanation about why we see different parts of the world integrated into empires in different ways. And I think that's something that's really worth taking on board.
Yeah, I also think when you look at Europe, and I'm having a lot of discussions with friends about this, but Europe, we seem to have mastered the art of having a cup of tea, sitting back, having a glass of wine, watching the world go by. If you go down to Italy, you'll see 10 old guys throwing dice or chatting, just all reading their own newspaper. But if you go to America, there's this kind of, they're all unsettled. They're always looking ahead. They want to keep building. They have this kind of sense of not being able to sort of relax and just look around and go, you know what, life's all right, and I'm kind of happy with my lot. Do you get that sense as well that in Europe we've kind of got more of a, this we go back centuries and millennia of civilization, and I think when you go to a country like America, it's not saying one is good or one is bad, but they're very much the only way out of a situation is to go to tech, and that's why we're seeing what Musk is doing. Like that, people. I mean, if you look at something like Meta and Facebook, it's pretty atrocious, but they laud it as this fantastic, amazing bit of technology which is employing so many people. It's not really, is it? It's just it's done more harm than good. It depends how you look at it.
America has a class system, but it never developed in the way that it did in Europe. And at least in part, I mean, I think it's a reasonable argument, you had the next wave of migrants. Okay, so just put it in terms of American culture, American perspectives. When America talk about left wing, they're talking about Democrats. The Democrats map to the Conservatives in the United Kingdom, who would never be considered as left wing. So there is a certain identity in American politics and American culture, which is further to the right than most nations and more focused on the success that business and commerce brings than status or education or the hereditary charms of being a lord or a baron or having a title in that regard. So you mentioned about American primordial. Um, this idea of the rugged individualism is still there, and it is embedded in American culture.
I'm going to segue into Canada's relationship with America then. Can you explain, from what you know, how Canada became Canada and America, the US became the US, and the difference? And now I'm happy to see Mark Carney's been made their PM because I interviewed him, and and I can't think of a better leader personally for Canada. But
Yeah, he did a pretty good job for the United Kingdom running the Bank of England.
solid guy.
Yeah, and the key issue is maintaining sovereignty and the link to the crown. So the Canadian provinces, um, we have the wars with France because, again, you think about America, they bought Alaska, they bought the Louisiana territories that France held, okay, but clearly not Quebec. So there
Can you
is
insert some dates just so we kind of know which era we're talking about?
okay. So
1800s?
the wars between France and Britain for dominance in North America obviously predate the War of Independence. So we're looking at the 18th century, the mid 18th century. But the Louisiana Purchase was 1803. Napoleon just didn't think that the American territories were very important and sold them to the American government, okay, for a song. Now, that's because he wanted to raise money to fight the British in Europe and in Africa and wherever they were challenging at the time.
And would I be right? And I think I read this morning that the French lent money, well, they're saying lent money to the Americans for the Battle of Independence.
Yeah. And you've got to bear in mind that in the War of 1812, the British forces burnt down the White House and could have potentially have retaken back America, but decided that beating Napoleon was more important and withdrew their forces. More than anything, Canada as a confederation, I think is 1867. I'd need to check up on that one. And they come to effectively run themselves as a nation. The head of state is still the British monarch. So let's just pause there. The American head of state wants to potentially annex the territory where our head of state has an interest, so to speak. Remember, the royal family went to Canada during the Second World War. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is the individualism and the distinctive cultural identity of Quebec for many Canadians is guaranteed by the Confederation, the links back to Britain, and the king as head of state. They're an independent, self-confident nation, but the further you go west in Canada, the less and less the French influence continues because they were never part of the Louisiana Purchase of the French territories. Okay, so Quebec was independent by the time the Americans bought the rest of the French territories in North America. Canadian culture is distinct. It is strongly influenced by America. And again, as we talked about, it is predominantly a European culture transposed. Mm-hmm. So the best way of thinking about it is Canada is a French, British influenced neo-Europe in North America. Mexico is a Spanish influenced neo-Europe. And the United States of America, arguably the most influential and wealthiest country in the world, is another neo-Europe. But they've stripped back on a lot of the European vestiges, as we talked about before, and they have understood that the economy and wealth are good indicators of success.
Yeah, that's what I get that sense that they definitely put that ahead of everything. And that is why America's quite addictive. I mean, a lot of people want to move to America because it's so forward thinking. They're building all the time. And not today, but normally a good economy, and it's kind of like a drug almost, because you come to Europe, you kind of can sit back, you don't have to do much, and no one's really going to question you. But in America, if you're sitting back not doing anything, you're going to notice, because someone's going to either kick you up the arse, or you're not going to be able to pay your medical bills or whatever it is. So it pushes them forward to keep building, building, building. And then Canada, just a few, nothing between them really. And it's amazing how these people are totally different. And I remember, because I've dealt with them a lot in business, and at the end of their email signatures, they say, "I acknowledge that Canada's history includes the displacement and mistreatment of Indigenous people. Reconciliation is an ongoing process, and I recognize the need for respect, awareness, and meaningful action in support of Indigenous communities." I hope they never get rid of that, and you'll never see that on an American email.
One of the things which is embedded in American culture, and for many people, the identity is, if you want it hard, if you want it and work hard enough, you can succeed. And I think that's still part of their ethos. It's not true. The reason that Thomas Piketty's book from 2014 ruffled so many feathers is that, okay, yeah, you can move within a certain band or boundary, but there are very few people like Oprah Winfrey or Bill Gates who are enormously successful and transcend we would call classes. Okay, so if you are a gas station owner in Wisconsin, right, becoming an oil magnate is incredibly unlikely, but you might aspire to that. Okay, and lots of people, I think the key word, and you see it with people's relationships in America, the use of the term settle. That people settle for a certain standard of life, okay, which means they've opted out of the American identity from progressivism or progressive success and therefore money making. Okay, and to find it when people have decided to give up waiting for their soulmate and have settled for their current boyfriend or girlfriend. You can argue it even further that people could make the sacrifices and be successful, but they've settled for this particular style of life. Okay. Now, one of the things I've been going through recently have been talking about where people want to be in their lives. And there's a group of individuals around the world who say Denmark, educated, reasonably wealthy, successful nation, but they have bought into the Scandinavian concept of enough. You don't need to keep on acquiring positions or money. You're judged to a certain degree by your family, your contribution to the community, a whole range of things around there. And many surveys put Denmark towards the top, if not the top, of the most contented or happiest nations in the world. Now, if you really want to be, slightly tongue-in-cheek on that, of course, the Vikings hail from that neck of the woods, so to speak, who were the most violent annexation specialists, so to speak, in the medieval world. And eventually you have a culture that comes back over years and is something very, very different.
Well, it's evolved. It's evolved, doesn't it? It's been allowed to evolve, and
Yeah.
I don't think America's had a chance to evolve. It's just gone too quick. It's just, everything's happened so fast. They haven't had the time. We've all got savagery in our history and our past, but there's it's very hard. I find America, and going back to that, but it's a very quick transition for them. You're going to Ukraine quickly. What's your personal view on this and the position UK is taking and the US?
I think you need to look a little bit about the way that President Trump is running his administration this time round. There is less chaos than when he took office in 2017, and different people clearly have different roles. J.D. Vance says the things that even President Trump doesn't want to do. Okay. And the reason I mentioned that was the comment about some random nation who hadn't been at war for 40 years. NATO action in Afghanistan came after the attack on a member nation. And you had a coalition of many nations there, including the United Kingdom. So,
what was the member nation?
The United States in 9/11 was the one that was attacked.
Oh, sorry. Of course, yeah. I wouldn't even.
Yeah.
I don't even associate. I associate it with a terror attack, and I don't think of it as an act of war. Especially when we didn't really understand which country it was coming from initially. It seemed they attacked the wrong one. But
well,
yeah, you are right. You are right, of course.
Yeah, and it is part of this issue that European NATO members, Canadians as well, didn't question this. That was a terrorist attack by a foreign influence, and at the time, the Afghanistan government was giving succor to Obama's bin Laden and the group that perpetrated this. Now, the reason I raise it like in those terms, Ukraine is very much seen by some European Union members as embedded in the European project. And what I say about the European project, look at the eastward push of the European Union and NATO. Even independent Sweden is worried and has joined NATO. Okay. That as far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine shouldn't exist. And the whole idea that the Ukraine would be given support is an anathema. So a lot has been talked about the negotiating stance of President Trump and his vice president with both Putin and Zelensky. One of the things that's coming out of this is that I think President Trump is quite comfortable with the idea that there would be foreign nations and peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. That would be an anathema to Putin.
Can you explain that word, anathema?
Yeah. He would see it as an impossibility.
I see.
He cannot conceive that Ukraine should be an independent nation, and therefore why should it be supported by others? All right. If you want a view on what some people are seeing as a difficult set of decisions by President Trump go back to the first American president, George Washington. And George Washington, in his final speech, when he stepped down for his second term, said, effectively, America should never pin its colours to any one national, supranational organization, whether it be an empire, whether it be an individual nation. I said, you judge the things, don't become part of the British Empire or the French Empire or the German Empire, or don't become so closely aligned with them that you become a target for their enemies. So the fact that President Trump can find common cause with Russia now and say, let's just stop the fighting, and to a certain degree pull back from previous commitments, George Washington effectively counseled the executive of America to say what's in America's interest and take it down that way. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think you can understand Zelensky being upset. It's his nation which has been invaded, and I think it's the comment about the time that Keir Starmer visited, when President Trump was challenged about describing Zelensky as a dictator, and he said, "Did I say that?" Everything is mutable. Nothing is bedded, and that's where it comes to the point I made earlier. President Trump's supporters aren't really worried about what he says. It's shaking the tree and getting things done. It's now a very deliberate strategy to mix things up, to be a disruptor and see what you can gain from that particular process.
Do you think the UK and Keir Starmer should be a bit harder with him and stop sort of playing like being his little puppy? Like I remember those old cartoons when, Bush and Tony Blair. I remember when I was younger, it was always like UK is the little puppy dog of the US. Isn't this a time for us to maybe go and stand with Canada and just say, look, this isn't on?
The real politics of the 47th president of the United States means that you can stand up to President Trump. You just don't do it directly. And so
I think people should, because then the American people would hear it, and the other half, they only need a couple more just to sort of push it over the edge. I mean, you got to remember, half of America really don't like the guy, and maybe having a sane country that calls out an insane leader. We do it if it's Russia. We do it if it's, say, any other country like Pinochet or anyone like that. Why can't we do it when it's right before our eyes? Why are we so scared?
Firstly, I think that within the operating parameters of having President Trump as the leader of the free world, Keir Starmer is playing a reasonably smart game. Okay, that's the first thing. Mark Carney, I think he's going to take a much harder line because it's much closer to home. Here is unfortunately the reality of it. Canada, faced with tariff sanctions, suddenly started to beef up their border forces. So did Mexico. If the intention of the United States president was to get Canada and Mexico to take more seriously their border security, by threatening, as the Americans say, their pocketbook, their wealth, he was successful.
I was
China,
afraid you're going to say that because there is this. You do hear the other side, and you do think, even though he is insane, maybe it does work, and it's almost a shame if it does work because it's worked in the most horrible way.
well,
To do, that's and it's not a game. It's not a game, and he could have done it without done it in a different way, is what I'm saying. And he's done it in an awful way. And there should be, if not now, there needs to be some kind of, I don't know, when the next administration comes in, there needs to be an apology, even if it works, because it's so atrocious what he's done to the world and put us all on our back for all of us wondering what's going to happen. He's taken over in the strongest economy in the world, and he's rattling it around, like you say, saber rattling with Putin. Look what he's doing. This has got to be there's got to be some kind of looking back at this at some point and say this can't happen again.
well, contrast how Canada and Mexico have acted compared to China. China have retaliated against the tariffs. They're looking to restrict American access to their markets. And here's the key thing you need to bear in mind: American finance, to a certain degree, is dependent on the trade surplus and the recycling of that trade surplus through financial centers from China. So China plays a different game because they're a different position relative to America. And it comes to the argument about Ukraine. Okay, I would like to see Russian forces withdraw from Ukraine. I see it as a completely illegitimate war, and I think every European nation that supports Ukraine has good reasons to do so. Okay, but America's focus looks like it's moving much more to South Korea and the support that North Korea are getting from other entities, and Taiwan and the threat that China poses to them. So the locus of America's international policy may well be becoming more what's been described as the Indo-Pacific theatre than the European one. And the logic that works with that is Trump is effectively saying, I'm going to need to spend more money supporting Taiwan and South Korea, much as he, in his first term, didn't like supporting South Korea. I'm going to have to turn my focus differently. I don't think that we're going to see this. Well, I stand corrected. There's a certain assumption that's already prevalent that what will happen in the next American election will be the same as Biden winning, that it will be a reversal against Trump, and there will be a
I think
change.
so. I think that kind of goes back to what we're saying, the identity
Yeah.
crisis. So they're going to be going back and forth until they can find a solution. It's in many ways the greatest country in the world, but they need to find a solution. They're going from this crazy extreme to another extreme, and that sounds like it might happen until they find a middle ground. So where they're happy. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Emmett. That's awesome to chat with you about this stuff, and hopefully you get something out of it as well.